May I invite on stage Ananta S., Director, Government Affairs and Public Policy, India, Intel Corporation, as well as Chris Miller, who is joining us virtually. He's Associate Professor in the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Jason Su, Senior Fellow, Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation, Harvard Kennedy School. Sagar Sharma, Chief of Staff, India Semiconductor Mission. And to moderate the session, may I invite Vrinda Kapoor, co-founder of 3RD Tech.
Hi, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to my fellow panelists. I think everybody here does really not need an introduction, so I'm going to quickly get started into the discussion. So I think the topic of today's discussion is a Bridgital USP, building unique semiconductor partnerships. And I couldn't have asked for a better group of people to have this discussion with, different perspectives between government, industry, people who have studied the semiconductor ecosystem and been a part of it, both from the US and Taiwan's perspective as well. So why are semiconductors all of a sudden so important? Why is all of this conversation going into it? Because I think today, apart from the fact that it's probably one of the most largely traded products in the world, when you look at it in the geopolitical lens between China and the US, it's also being viewed by the United States as a national security asset, right? And we're starting to see a lot of silent changes, large and small, that are becoming ripple effects of the semiconductor ecosystem. So with that, I'd like to quickly get started. And my first question is really going to be to Ananta, who's joining us as Director of Government Affairs and Public Policy in Intel. The Indian Semiconductor Mission was launched with a lot of fanfare last year. We've seen a lot of negotiation happening between government and industry over the last year. We're starting to see interest from foreign companies, foreign countries, and Intel as well in participating in this mission. So I think my question is twofold. The first is that what more do you need, or what more from industry's perspective does Government of India need to put onto the table? How do they need to do it?
Thanks, Vrinda. I mean, happy to be here. Thanks. I think the first thing is the policy-wise, the policy itself is a well-thought-through policy, right? I mean, I think you can't really complain anything. The policy has carve-outs for the large incentives comparable to other geos. It has carve-outs for IP creation, it has carve-outs for talent development, things like that. So from a policy perspective, I think it has all the ideal stuff, and it is very compelling and competitive. The challenge that the Indian government has today is that it's not just the Indian government who are providing those, right? I mean, I think all these incentives are available elsewhere as well, right? So that sort of makes it difficult, especially if you consider the fact that there is so much of ecosystem that is required, which is not available in this country yet, and the focus on that is something that is required, right? And the other thing is, I think we got to do a better job of marketing, the value that India provides, the opportunity India is, the thing that has changed in India. I think it's more of marketing that is required, and apart from that, I think there is also the requirement of trying to create, not just go after everything, right? But look at specific technologies, specific products, specific use cases. Create a pathway for creating a large market, right, in those space, right, and then go back and attract companies that can actually serve that. So that way, people who are coming to invest will see a path towards business viability, right, and ecosystem and other things, right. So maybe that is something that could be done more in the policy.
So if I were to summarize that, I would say that government of India still needs to figure out the product market fit to make the semiconductor mission viable, point number one. And point number two, what we need to realize internally is that it's not good enough that we are coming up with new policy. We need to be globally competitive in this age, right? So with that, Jason, over to you. And I think this would be a very interesting point for everybody in the audience to hear your views on, is with all of the countries in the world right now on this multilateral approach towards foundries. What is Taiwan's perspective, and what do you believe is TSMC's strategy?
Sure. Great to be here, and thank you for having me. So my work is in the intersection of technology and geopolitics, and formerly I was a legislator in Taiwan's legislature, overseeing technology, foreign policy, and defense. So the position of Taiwan's semiconductor is trying to navigate the murky water of the geopolitical risks vis-a-vis US and China great power competition. And obviously, TSMC, with its unique positioning and business model, have been able to provide Taiwan some sort of protection against the China's invasion. But now we are seeing this technology, or I should say industry, being weaponized against the US and China competition. So Taiwan is really stuck in between a hard place and a rock. So how do we move forward, given that, number one, we still maintain a leading position in this technology, namely TSMC. But secondly, we are also facing tremendous amount of pressure to diversify. And the risk is obviously looming in the Taiwan Strait as US and China tension continue to escalate. So a couple of potential scenarios going forward concerning TSMC. You might have read the news when Biden and Xi Jinping met in G20 earlier this month. TSMC quietly announced a second fab in Arizona, where the first fab will be up and running next year. It will be churning out 5 nanometers with 5,000 wafers on a monthly basis. The second fab they are putting is a 3 nanometer one, and they've actually purchased enough land to build 6 fabs in Arizona. So this very action of a diversification also tells we are looking at a ever more increasingly geopolitically risky situation of the industry. And TSMC is likely to continue to diversify in the next few years to come. Right now, the 90% of advanced microchips is produced by one company, that's TSMC. It's likely to diversify 10 to 20% to the US, and then another 10% the rest of the world, possibly Europe and Japan, and then keep the 60%, or more or less 50 to 60% still maintaining in Taiwan. So again, this silicon shield theory that semiconductor provide a protection for Taiwan has becoming quite a bit of a flashpoint and quite a bit of a trigger as well. So we have been very, very careful, and also looking to work with our allies, countries that might be interested in building what I call a silicon alliance to work together to develop a potential stronger network for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. And I think a Silicon Alliance is going to trump most geopolitical alliances in critical and emergent technology, at least in the next 2 decades, because diversification of supply chains, which we've seen as a choke point to even the best intentioned and the most market-driven approaches, has started to become an issue. But secondly, because the amount of resources that have been poured in by the Taiwanese government and TSMC in particular into developing that lead really needs to be protected from my perspective at least. So this would bring me to Chris. Chris, thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you. Your book has been, I think, very widely read by a lot of us here. We've really enjoyed it. the last decade, before I think the pandemic made everybody acutely aware of semiconductor supply chains and their shortages and choke points, the last decade saw a lot of market-driven approach, market-led growth of the industry. But what we're starting to see is all of a sudden things have turned, and state-led intervention and subsidies are becoming very, very common. We're seeing it in the US, we're seeing it in the European Union, we're seeing this in India, we're seeing this all over. My question to you is twofold. One is, are these state interventions really going to work out? Have they been well thought through? And do you see implementation challenges? And the second is, in particular, I'd like you to discuss the impact of the CHIPS Act on the larger global supply chain.
Well, thanks for the question, and thank you for having me in this discussion. I think the question of properly targeting state subsidies is a critical one. And I do worry that in some countries, state subsidies are not well targeted. I think one of the dynamics that is present in all countries that are investing more in their chip industry is a desire to have more manufacturing of semiconductors in their country. And that's an understandable goal. But the reality is that we can't have a situation in which every country manufactures all of the semiconductors they need. The supply chain just doesn't work that way. And I think there's been, in general, a overestimation of the importance of fabrication relative to other steps in the supply chain. Design, for example, is where most of the value in the semiconductor industry is produced. And yet political officials are far more keen to talk about manufacturing than chip design. And I think that's often a mistake. If you look at the US CHIPS Act, most of the money that Congress has appropriated is going to go towards subsidizing chip manufacturing in the US. Around $39 billion is supposed to be spent over the next 5 years. And an additional $12 to $13 billion is being allocated to R&D efforts that will focus on design, on packaging, on advanced fabrication. So in the US as well, there's a lot of focus in terms of attention and also in terms of dollars on the fabrication piece, and probably less than there ought to be on design and on packaging. And I'll just flag packaging as well as another area of potential focus. In the past, packaging has been seen as a low tech and low value added part of the supply chain. But one of the key trends in the industry, referred to as advanced packaging, is using more technology and newer methods in the packaging process. And I think there's a pretty clear consensus in the industry that in 10 years' time, packaging will be more important, will be higher tech, and as a result deserves more government focus than it traditionally has received. And so when I talk to officials in Europe or Japan or the US, my message is generally to focus a bit less on manufacturing. There's plenty of focus there. And instead, make sure you're devoting enough attention to other parts of the supply chain, which are equally critical and are in some ways easier, I think, to impact than the very expensive fabrication process. One final point is that the country that's spending more than any others to subsidize fabrication is China, which is pouring tens of billions of dollars each year into building out its fabrication capacities. And no one is going to win a subsidy race with China. And so any country that is trying to subsidize more than China for the fabrication step is going to find themselves with businesses that are struggling to compete because Chinese firms are just going to get more subsidies. That's a fact of the matter. And so I think subsidy packages need to be designed in a way that recognize that China is spending one CHIPS Act per year in subsidies, whereas the US CHIPS Act is designed to last an entire decade. And it's just not a smart move to get in a subsidy race with China, which China has repeatedly shown it's willing and able to win. So our strategies have got to be smarter than that. And simply focusing on subsidizing manufacturing is not the right way to go.
Thanks, Chris. And I think, that's a really important point as governments across the world are, or policymakers rather across the world are focused on tangible assets. And I think this was one of the points that was raised in a discussion yesterday. Governments, politicians, policymakers tend to vie more towards physical assets that they can touch and feel and inaugurate, right? While I think a broader understanding of this industry is really needed to make each of these foundries viable over the next couple of years. So I think you raised a really interesting point on semiconductor design and sort of the lower end I wouldn't call it lower end in terms of challenges, but the lower financial end of the spectrum. And there, I think, is an area where India can really distinguish itself, because we've got, as per recent reports, up to 20% of the world's semiconductor designers, but none of them involved in building products from this country, right? Most of our manpower is working in back-end or in services companies or foreign firms. So there, from what, recently the Honorable Minister of State for Electronics, Information Technology, Skill Development and Entrepreneurship, Sri Chandrasekhar, flagged off a roadshow focused on promoting the design-linked incentive scheme, which is primarily to target this audience. When the Prime Minister announced the Semiconductor Mission, he flagged off a very ambitious goal that he wanted 100 startups or SMEs coming up in India through this mission. So Sagar, what I would like to turn to you and ask is, what has been the progress under the scheme so far? I know that there have been a lot of back and forths with large industry on the fabrication side, on the facility side, but has there been engagement with the startups and the SMEs? Have there been changes to the policy? Do we see changes to the policy coming up? And is ISM working to kind of bridge that gap between what's happening in METI and what's, what the industry is really looking for?
Good evening, everyone, and thanks for having me here. So, Vrinda, to answer your question, yes, there are a lot of deliberations and discussions to, decide on the right sort of actions that the India Semiconductor Mission or the ministry has to take. But just a caveat here, the India Semiconductor Mission is the nodal agency for the manufacturing-related incentives, and we are not the nodal agency for the design-link incentive scheme. But I'm aware that we are engaging heavily with the startups and with the VC networks, with the EDA companies, in order to create that kind of ecosystem which can, support the design ecosystem. As you mentioned, we house 20% of the world's semiconductor design engineers, and even across the world, if you see, there is a significant presence of Indian brains doing semiconductor design. So the idea is, yes, as Prime Minister mentioned when we announced the policies, that we have to create 100 domestic semiconductor design companies and 85,000 semiconductor design engineers also. So I think there are a lot of deliberations and discussions, and there have been many applications which have been scrutinized at multiple levels, and there has been the committees has been placed to give the final approvals to the applicants. So I think the progress is decent, and we will very soon hear the names of the selected applicants when it comes to the design-link incentive schemes. Yeah. So was there any question related to manufacturing bit?
Yes, so on manufacturing, the second question was going to be on the foundry-associated ecosystem, as I like to call it, right? So what are our plans as a country to tap into that part of it? So we hear mostly about the foundries, but it would be great for at least all of us from the industry to understand, packaging, the entire post-processing. What can we do to incentivize that happening over here?
Yes, absolutely. And I think the word which is very dear to us in the ISM is the ecosystem. So when we frame our policy and when we discuss and engage with the industry, we are, for the ecosystem. Yes, foundry is one of the important component of the larger semiconductor ecosystem, but we understand that how the ecosystem, the semiconductor, like Taiwan, there was some TI which set up a back-end facility in 1960 in Taiwan, and then how, eventually the foundry model disrupted the entire industry, and we have a TSMC, which is now, I think, one of the most important country for the entire world. So we also have that understanding, and that's how, when our Prime Minister announced the scheme, he made a statement that we don't have any other option but to be self-reliant in semiconductors. But when we talk about self-reliance, we mean better integration with the global value chain. Partnerships and the integrations are the core philosophy of our entire program. We understand that semiconductor supply chain is very complex. It's tech-intensive. A semiconductor chip crosses 70 international borders before being delivered to the final consumer. So with that kind of diverse ecosystem, a complex supply chain, we understand that there is a concentration. As Jason mentioned, 92% of the most advanced semiconductor chips are coming not from one country but from one company. This kind of concentration is considering the importance of semiconductors. We start our days with semiconductor when our mobile rings the alarm. Similarly, during the day we interact with semiconductors million times, and even when we sleep we interact with semiconductors. So with that kind of close link with the human civilization and the modern digital knowledge-based society where we cannot ignore semiconductors, the concentration is not good, not only for us but for the world. So that's the philosophy with which we work, that we need to be a reliable and trusted partner in the global value chain for semiconductors. Yeah.
Yeah, just on the part of the partnership and also kind of India's ambition and a program for a semiconductor. So when I was in the parliament, we started something called Taiwan and India Semiconductor Training Program. So every year, India sent about 1,000 students to Taiwan. And over the years, it's grown to 2,000. And a majority of them study for advanced degrees and later stayed in Taiwan, and they end up working for TSMC, UMC, MediaTek, and basically the whole ecosystem. And the success of Taiwan's semiconductor industry is really an ecosystem success. It's not, although it's a single company that's making all the advanced microchips, but it's really the recipe of the ecosystem. And so today, if you tour the TSMC in its headquarters in Hsinchu, in Taiwan, you'll see 500 to 600 Indian engineers working on the fab. So I believe that there could be something stronger can be built between Taiwan and India to develop talent development and as well as talent circulation. And I think there would be a good complementary program to start it. Yeah.
Absolutely, Jason. I think
I'm happy to make the connection of that.
Yeah, absolutely, and I completely agree, and I'm aware about the program which you're talking about. And similarly, we have exchange program with our top IITs, where we are partnering with the universities in Taiwan, and lot of Taiwanese companies, including TSMC, come for the campus placement in all our premier colleges every year. So talent is one, and apart from that, I think the back-end operations are also the other possibilities where there is a natural partnership, and probably we can discuss offline as well.
So, as it said in my introduction, I run a semiconductor fabless company based in Delhi over here, and my team has grown up at IMEC and then, working with Taiwan. And one of the things which always struck me as so interesting was the culture that you've managed to create in Taiwan, where a university and a fab are adjacent to each other, and even professors from computer science are sending their students to go do tape-outs, on a monthly basis to test out new silicon. So I found that really fascinating. With that, I'd really like to come back to Ananta. We've heard, Taiwan, India, Indian Semiconductor Mission, Taiwan's interest in cooperation and, spreading the Semiconductor Alliance. As one of the few really globally major present companies in this sphere, you're talking to, I think, almost every government that's working on a semiconductor policy right now. What would be really interesting would be to get your perspective and Intel's perspective on how some of these alliances, let's say the Quad, let's say ISET between the US and India, can really be leveraged in terms of policy. One of the examples that I've heard is, getting fabrication support for new companies usually remains a challenge. Is that something that can we navigate? Can we navigate on trailing edge nodes? Can we come together and create a cohesive pathway forward with industry in the loop, so that the entire supply chain that gets stood up using these government subsidies remains financially viable for the next 2 decades?
Can't specifically comment on what Intel does, but in general, there are multiple areas for cooperation, as Chris and others have spoken, right? Talent is one great area, and India is a lot of talent. We've been able to generate the talent, right? And that's one area of cooperation. And if the amount of investment that each country has set, right? US, Europe, right? Japan, right? Malaysia, and all the other places, right? I mean, the requirement for trained talent is so high, right? By the time all these things come online, there's so much requirement. And India has the talent and train it and provide to them. That's one area. Second thing, if you look at it, most of the developed nations' focus has been on leading edge nodes, right? I mean, not so much focus on trailing edge nodes, right? And again, as part of the India's policy, we are not looking at leading edge node. We're looking at sort of trailing edge node. That's an opportunity where the US focuses on leading edge. We could provide support on the trailing edge, and sort of a de-risk, in terms of the geopolitics that's happening, right? So that's a great area of cooperation. The third thing is about there are many suppliers. I mean, if you look at many components that go into fab, ATMPs, right? A lot of them are where Indian companies can really participate, right? Is there a way in which we can get Indian companies, suppliers to part of that main ecosystem? Those are all short-term stuff that we could do, right? And those are all easy things to do. And there are many chemicals and other which are single supplier, right? Comes from one region, one this thing. Can we look at developing those capabilities, right? To sort of this de-risking, approach that various companies are doing, right? So there are multiple opportunities to look at it, but what it needs is a collaborative forum where you can discuss this, right? Look at places where we can provide support today, right? And be complementary to what each other country is doing. I think there are opportunities to do that.
I mean, so we've often spoken about how, multilateral engagements like the Quad or ISET really deserve a track 1.5 for industry to participate, for their perspective to be brought in. And I think when it comes to semiconductors, I can't stress that more because it's eventually going to be an industry-led approach, right? Government subsidies will only come in to augment or supplement that. So Chris, I'd like to turn back to you because I think this is a very interesting area, and I know that this is an area of interest for you in particular. Can we use semiconductors and research in semiconductors to catalyze US-India cooperation? Can it be through ISET? Can it be through partnership between the military and R&D on dual-use products? Would really love to hear your perspective on that.
Well, I do think that should be a focus. And as the US and India both try to find ways to build up their semiconductor industries, I think finding pathways for cooperation at the R&D level, at the academic level, and also at the industry level is going to be critical. It's certainly the case that statements from the Quad, for example, have identified semiconductors as one area for cooperation. I think thus far, we haven't gotten very far past just statements identifying that as an area of cooperation. And in terms of sketching out what that actually means in practice, there's a lot of work to be done. But certainly one of the messages that I take to Washington when I speak with policymakers there is the importance of thinking about when the US is trying to revitalize its R&D ecosystem, thinking about ways that can plug in to partner states. And I think India is a great example of a country whose chip industry, with all of the designers in India, are already engaged with the US R&D base, and finding ways to enhance that is, I think, a smart area for policymakers in both Washington and in New Delhi to focus on. In addition to that, I would say the military and security aspect is something that currently exists only on a very, very small scale, but there is scope for more joint R&D on that front. I think there are a lot of hurdles that need to be overcome. Both countries, for example, have plenty of security protocols that make cooperation more difficult, but there is, I think, scope for thinking about ways in which there can be joint R&D between the US and India, even in sensitive spheres like security and military systems. And given the alignment between the US and India's foreign policy in terms of the big challenge in the Indo-Pacific region, I think there's not just a industry push or economic rationale for this cooperation, but also a security rationale. And making sure that we've got industry and foreign policymakers aligned and working together, I think, is an important part of actually realizing this potential for cooperation.
Thanks, Chris. And that brings me to a really interesting point. And Jason, I'd like to address this to you. So it's been said very often that the military trails the commercial industry when it comes to the trailing and the leading edge nodes in semiconductors. Historically, most military products effectively follow the nanometer race by at least a generation or two. And partly it's due to the required functionality, but it's also partly due to military is a sticky customer and doesn't really want to change. We're starting to see, at least in the Chinese context, a huge amount of investment in trailing edge nodes. a large number of fabless companies coming up to support PLA military activities on those trailing edge nodes. Is that an area of cooperation between the US, Taiwan, and India that could be, on the table, focusing on dual-use products with some of those trailing edge nodes? And would that be an interesting opportunity for Taiwan to, perhaps consider branching out with some of those trailing edge nodes into Indian foundries?
Yeah, really good question. And I think Chris's book, Chip War, which I highly recommend. I actually just finished reading it on the airplane here, and I recommend everyone here should read it, and has a very detailed, well-researched content about the history of microchips. And I think it has a application in the military use, and it has a lot of potential in a dual-use technology as well. And certainly that has been a part of history during the Soviet Cold War era, and as well as when semiconductor was first established. And I will say that the advanced nodes chips that TSMC produced, the 3 nanometers and or even the ones that they are now innovating in Taiwan, 2 nanometers or sub 2 nanometers. There are 14 fabs now in Taiwan, and two or three more are being built as we speak that will be innovating the 2 nanometers and above, are indeed used for what I call next generation digital economy products, such as your mobile phone, your iPhone, or any sort of telecommunication devices that require large amount of computing power, and as well as a real-time processing of the data volume. Now, the semiconductors that are used for weapons is actually not advanced nodes. They are actually the legacy nodes that are actually used in these missiles or platforms to launch the weapons. But these advanced nodes are used in the high-performance computing, in artificial intelligence or surveillance technology that are being used to analyze and as well as develop the big data algorithm. So these are the concern of national security, and I believe that's why U.S. is targeting on China's ability to access the advanced microchips. And this is the area of the competition between U.S. and China. And I want to say that how do we look at this piece of technology that is advancing really the future communication of the humanity, but now it's being weaponized at this era of the great power competition. So I think that sort of leaves everyone here with a question: where do we go from here, and how do we steer the course of development so that we can all work together to make sure that this technology, this piece of technology, doesn't become like a nuclear warheads in the Cold War era that is being weaponized. So that's something I think we all need to think about, and I believe for the security concern, today's technology company is viewed through the lens of national security. Whether or not we can cooperate on the dual-use technology, I think it needs a deeper conversation, and as to on what level countries should work together, and are we entering into a so-called a world with two chips system, where China is developing its chips, pushing it to the Belt Road Initiative countries, or Middle Asia, Eastern Europe, and etc., and the U.S. is forming its alliance, and where are we headed towards this type of course of collision? So I think that's something has always been on my mind. I'm sure it's on Chris's mind as well. So I think that's sort of an open-ended question answer to it. Yeah.
Thank you. That's, I think, really fascinating. So, Sagar, with that, I'd like to come back to you. we've seen from the US, we've seen it in Europe, we've seen it in China, we've seen some of the, I guess Chris's book highlighted the mistakes that were made in the post-Cold War Russia. But we see this increasing, well, it's always been there, so I wouldn't say increasing, but we see semiconductors being an integral part of security systems, of communication backbones, of AI backbones, which are going to not just power our military, but also our digital economy, the privacy of each of our citizens. From the Indian semiconductor mission's perspective, where is security and national security a priority in the semiconductor mission? And it would be really interesting to hear if that's part of the roadmap, if that's something that is being actively worked on. Are the security establishments being actively involved, and if there is a future in which they will be?
Oh, yes, in the modern times, where especially in India, where the digital revolution is like taken another shape, we have around 1.3 billion Aadhaar cards, more than 1 billion bank accounts, 750 million plus mobile phone users. In this kind of scenario where the world is so connected, and our critical communication infrastructure, considering everything, where the semiconductors are the heart of all those machines, security is a key thing, So we say data is the new oil. So we also say in our parlance that semiconductors are the oil tankers. So they keep all that data, safe. So it's very important that we have to ensure that there is no leakage, they are protected, etc., etc. So yes, right now, though we are at a very nascent stage, we are building up the commercial manufacturing ecosystem. But we very well understand that we need to put a regime or an understanding and clarity, with the kind of modern algorithms which are evolving. It is very important that security cannot be compromised. So yes, the discussions are going on, and we are on building up a roadmap that how we will make a trusted semiconductor value chain in the country.
Thank you. So with that, Ananta, back to you. From India's perspective, from the Indian semiconductor mission's positive, what are the next steps that companies like Intel need to see in order to and I'm not asking about Intel specifically, I'm asking for global semiconductor players. What are the next steps industry needs to see in order to catalyze this discussion that's been going on since the mission was announced last year into actual actionables and next steps?
I think the one fact is clear is, maybe ultimately fab in India will be a reality, right? The only question is how long it's going to take, right? And I think what we need to do is have a short range goal, medium and long term kind of a planning. Start looking at in the short term, what are the areas that India can do to plug into that global supply chain ecosystem, right? Be it talent, be it, supply systems and other things, right? Look at, as Chris said, start looking at ATMP, right? Maybe analog nodes or other stuff that we can actually slowly progress over complexity, right? And as people come, set up systems here, right? And see that, and progressively things will happen, especially considering the fact that there is this design ecosystem already available, right? The system manufacturing through PLI has taken big time, right? So we have the other ecosystem developing, right? And it's a matter of time, these things will develop. The other thing, that we've been pretty vocal about and had been trying to tell the ministry understands is that, we should stop looking at saying that, to companies that, come and, set up something in India. I think we got to be telling to companies that, what can India do to them to support their ambition and vision of being, their vision of, their companies, right? So that way, we have this opportunity to start working collaboratively with them, helping them do that, and over a period of time, and I think, things will start happening in the country.
So Jason, that brings me to you. I think it would be, everybody is sitting at the edge of their seats to see if TSMC or any of the other large Taiwanese majors would ever or would consider this to be an opportune time to set up some sort of a relationship in India right now. It may not be a foundry right away. It may not be a leading edge node. It may be a trailing edge node. But it would be I think a lot of people would be very interested to see that as an outcome. And I understand that there would be a significant amount of, outreach, understanding of the requirements, etc. required. But really, if we were to think about the top 3 things that would make this decision viable for TSMC, for UMC, for any of the Taiwanese companies, what would it be?
Yeah, I think the question we ought to be asking is, what is the strategy for India's semiconductor program? In other words, if you were to dissect the entire ecosystem, what sector or what segment does the country want to focus on? So, not every country should build a fab. I think that was something that I would say. If India is good with the talent in design and in using the design to develop the chips that can be manufactured by TSMC or other companies, and yet but the design can be proprietarily owned or developed by Indian talent. I think that would be a niche that India should be thinking about. Now, semiconductor is a long game. If you look at what U.S. is doing with CHIPS Act, it took Taiwan 30 to 40 years to get to where we are today. But CHIPS Act is just one thing. Will they do a CHIPS Act 2, CHIPS Act 3, CHIPS Act 4? We have to see it. And the $52 billion that comes with the CHIPS Act is significantly lower than what private sector is investing and against what China is investing as a country. And so if you look at this, it's a long-term commitment in building the foundry. And really for today's supply chain and the integration of the supply chain, it would only work if all the elements are in place, which means that you have the entire ecosystem. So not just one TSMC, but everything that's sort of surrounded TSMC in making it a viable and cost-effective and high-quality output, as well as the business model. So is India ready to commit long-term resources like this? Or India could choose a more innovative approach in utilizing the software talent in circuit design or the chip design or the quantum computing. And chips are still applicable in a lot of things. So I think and Chris Brooks also talk about it, is TSMC's brilliance is in it works with the clients in advancing technology and the manufacturing process. So doesn't have to duplicate TSMC's model, that's what I would say, but figuring out where your niche is, but then work with the existing leaders to advance your niche and make it an irreplaceable advantage against the others.
So that's really interesting, because one of the things that I learned when we started this journey with TSMC was how every couple of years there's a spin-off that comes out of a new piece of R&D that TSMC is working on. And it was very interesting to me to learn that things like microlenses and color filters emerged as a spin-off from TSMC and then have become integral, very, very large companies, adding so much value to the end customer right there. So with that, I think one of my last questions is going to be to Chris. I think you have a breadth of knowledge, Chris, on the history of the semiconductor ecosystem. You have studied the US model, the European model, the Russian model, the Taiwanese model, and very recently the Chinese model. As India starts off its fledgling chip design ecosystem, and I know that that's an area that you have stressed on, what would be your advice to the policymakers on what it would take to build an IP-rich, unique, differentiated ecosystem in this country?
Well, I would flag two dynamics that I think have been present throughout the history of the industry and I think are quite relevant today. The first is to have as close a possible relationship between academic researchers and R&D happening in companies. Because one of the things that you find historically is that if there's a gap between the research happening in universities and the research happening in companies, you don't have the knowledge transfer out of universities to companies in a fast enough manner to be relevant commercially. And so the more integration you can get between academic research and corporate R&D, the better off an ecosystem will be. I think the second dynamic, which has been present throughout the industry's history as well, is that the way to make progress and the way to advance technologically is to integrate as deeply as possible with leading suppliers around the world. When countries have tried self-sufficiency, tried to do it on their own, it has always failed. And the countries that have succeeded in jumping ahead in their technological capabilities, like Taiwan, which 40 years ago was a tiny player in the global electronics industry and today is absolutely at the center. TSMC succeeded in large part because it integrated very, very deeply. It bought components and tools from the best companies in the world. It worked to supply some of the leading chip designers in the world, and it learned from all of the different companies it was collaborating with. And that learning was only possible because it integrated very deeply, and self-sufficiency was never seen as a viable strategy. If you look at South Korea, for example, companies like Samsung have exactly the same story. It hasn't been about self-sufficiency. It's been about integration with the world's leaders. And integration is only possible if companies are able to find a specific niche in the supply chain that they can focus on and trust in the already existing international supply chain to help with the other steps. And so finding the right way to integrate and focusing on integration is, I think, critical for countries like India that are trying to play a bigger role in semiconductors. But doing it all on your own is simply impossible. It's impossible for the US, it's impossible for Japan, it's impossible for Taiwan, and it would be impossible for anyone else who tries. And so structuring that international integration and finding the right places to integrate, I think, is going to be critical to India's success or to any country's success.
Thank you. And my last comments, I want both Sagar and Ananta to look in, picking up from what Chris said right now. There is a sense in the community that governments, especially large governments like the government of India, tend to spray and pray, boil the ocean, right? There is not enough focus on creating niches. And as a result, the impact that we see at the end of 2, 3, 5 years and a couple of $1 billion remains minimal at best. Sagar, from ISM's perspective, are there niches that have been identified that we need to go after? Is there a plan to get there? And Ananta, from industry's perspective, I know you talked about it briefly, but what is the market-driven approach that would actually result in a focused and a successful outcome?
So yes, there is the understanding that for some particular segments, India is a better, for example, the automobile segment, the thrust which we are giving to the non-conventional energy sources. So the renewable energy is another sector where the RF, the kind of telecom market India is. So these are the segments which we understand are critical for us, and so that's how you see the philosophy of our incentive package or our policy. So even in our policy, the entire Semicon India program, we have created those niches as well. So there is a niche of display, there is a niche of compound semiconductors where we are giving 50% upfront incentives for silicon carbide based devices or GaN based devices or discrete silicon photonics. Similarly, we have a niche for the packaging. Again, same upfront 50% incentives for setting up the packaging unit in India. So with this kind of incentives, I think Government of India has done its part when it comes to the fiscal support. And the other key, like incentives are important, but that's not the only thing which will make the ecosystem work. And so that's how we are working very closely with the state's government to enable the ecosystem. So there's an instance that Gujarat government has come up with their dedicated semiconductor policy where they are trying to create a semiconductor city. They have allocated 10,000 acres of area for creating a semiconductor city. They're providing 30 MLD water to start with today. And there is a roadmap to get it to 300 MLD. Similarly, power, they are providing quality power to run 2 fabs even today. Similarly, international airport, 6 lanes highways, etc., etc. And the port connectivity is also there, like, within a radius of 300 kilometers, there are 4 ports from Dulera, where they are planning to set up the semiconductor city. So I think we have identified our niche areas, and we are working very closely to enable the ecosystem for growing that niches. Yeah.
Just to answer that question, Vrinda, I think if you look at the India policy making, of style, I mean, if I can call that right, it's always been iterative, right? I mean, there is a policy that's brought in. They look at what's there are a lot of feedbacks given on it, right? They look at what are the strength, weakness. Then there is a 2.0 that comes in, then the 3.0, right? We have seen that happen in PLI, right? PLI 1 worked pretty well for mobiles. It didn't work for IT products, right? So the PLI 2.0 is trying to fix those problems, right? Which I think will fairly good. So I don't think this is an exception. I think the policy has already gone one revision, trying to bring in all those incentive part of it, right? I'm sure, and I'm happy that, at least there is this understanding that, we need to, the next version of the policy that comes in will bring in all these elements of learning in terms of trying to be focused, market driven, right? And look at those niche areas, that where we can play, right? And I think I'm hopeful that, we will see more action in the coming months and weeks in terms of, a government trying to bring out that, right? And of all the learnings, that they've had in the first policy. I think we will see that in the next one.
Thank you, gentlemen. I think we've reached just about the end of our time. This has been a very engaging and meaningful discussion. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us, and thank you to our audience for sitting through and listening to us. So.